Okay, hi. So here I'm going to just begin talking about Judaism with a bit of an intro on the origins of it in the ancient religion of Israel. And so this, as I mentioned in my little intro video, this is sort of the biblical period that we often refer to as Proto-Judaism. Okay, that's very foundational to Judaism. And for context here, we need to, first of all, position ourselves that this is all taking place here in the current Middle East, which we then, for ancient times, is referred to as the ancient Near East. And as you can see a bit of a map here, this would be sort of the area of present-day Iraq, but also modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, aspects of Arabia, Egypt, etc., as you can see here. And so this region here of ancient Mesopotamia meaning between the two rivers, the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, as you can probably see there in the light blue. Those are the two main rivers. This was very much what's often referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Early populations develop here, and the first civilization gets born here, and they were known as the Sumerians, okay, going back to about 4000 BC. And they positioned themselves, people settled in this area, developing agriculture along the river where they were able to irrigate the land by creating canals drawing off of the river so they could regularly control the water input into the crops and get regular growth of their crops. And that then allowed them to stay settled in this region and become fairly well off and more sustained sustenance, okay? And so things get developed here, at this time period. And we have a number of very old city-states that start to develop, where various cities start to develop and they have their independence one from the other, where the king of the city, in a sense, that was his little terrain. So this is ancient Sumeria, all right, the oldest civilization in the world. And what makes it a civilization is that they developed writing. And once you have the development of writing, you then have, the written transmission of education from one generation to the next, okay? And it's not just an oral culture, it becomes a written culture. And so, of course, we've got a lot of tablets, Sumerian tablets of that time period that tells us a lot about what the people believed at this time. And I just want to make note here so you can see on this map. See at the bottom here, where I'm pointing my finger, you can't see that, the city of Ur. This is going to be the city that is held that Abraham, sort of the father, the patriarch of the Jewish people, left the city of Ur to go over towards the west, which would become the land of Israel down the road. Okay, that's where the story will begin here. But anyways, to go back though here with the Sumerians that were dominant in this region, as I mentioned, they settled in this region and around 4500 BC, and eventually they develop a civilization with the development of writing and become quite sophisticated here with rather large populations, of hundreds of thousands of people in the various cities here. And so they were highly organized, and in each city they had at the center of it a temple. As you can see here on the lower left, it would be called a ziggurat. They'd have these temples that would be associated with the palace of the king. That was always central to every city. And so the next slide here kind of just highlights some of the beliefs that we have, and that's of course our interest here is religious beliefs at this time period. And what we find here is very common throughout the world in ancient societies. And, they're polytheistic, a belief in hundreds of deities. They're largely associated with forces of nature, so they often are seen as personifications of the forces of nature. Sun deity, moon deity, of the sky, of the water, of the cattle, various aspects of nature. They're also highly anthropomorphic, very human-like, right? They're just like us. They eat, drink, fight, they can die, they're born, they can go at war. They're very human-like, okay? That's very much the norm. And what we find here is priesthoods established and associated with all of these different temples, where the religion is focused on serving the local ruler or king, okay, in these city-states. Excuse me. The various deities sort of made up a pantheon, like a shared collection of deities that pretty much all Sumerians believed in. Okay, but each city had sort of one of these gods being dominant, being the patron deity, and was the one that would be housed in the main temple of that city. And that temple was seen as its palace, its place of abode here on earth, its house on earth. You know, like later in Arabia, we'll see the house of Allah in Mecca. It's like its house here on earth. Okay, and also what's very typical, and you'll see this definitely throughout India when we do Hinduism, right, is that these deities had specific images that they were made into, reflecting, symbolizing these images, and they were treated as though, you know, the spirit, the deity was present in that image. It would be daily fed, bathed, put to bed, prayed to, okay, where as though that deity is actually there in that image. Okay, and this is very much, again, the norm in terms of religious beliefs in this region. And so we also find a strong emphasis on divination, the attempt to divine the future, to know what the gods are up to, what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, again, something you find all over the world, very much the norm. And with this, the reading of signs, omens, the movement of animals, birds, the planets, the stars, the sun, the moon, just there are signs out there in the universe that have messages that can give us some kind of guidance and insight as to what's about to happen. Okay, that's where astrology comes from, that, and all kinds of things. Excuse me. And we also have, again, find this all over the world, the use of magic, various kind of magical rituals through the words of power, all right, certain incantations and various objects and particular ritual that you can use magic for protection from harm, to bring about healing, to get your prayers answered, various things, that there are things that you can do to influence these invisible spiritual forces for your benefit. The gods were largely seen as being rather unpredictable. You know, you just don't know for sure what they're going to do. And then, indeed, there's a belief that there's an afterlife. You don't have the concept of reincarnation here. Likewise, in ancient India, you didn't. Well, at least, you know, with the Aryans coming in, what we have of early Hinduism, and also in China. You know, reincarnation is a concept that develops later in history. And likewise here, it's believed that you just have the one life. And the afterlife wasn't anything great, but it also wasn't a place of torture and torment, nor was it necessarily wonderful bliss. It was just sort of a dark, shadowy underworld, okay, called the land of no return. Nothing to look forward to. The focus was here on earth in this life now, right? That's the focus. And as you can see here, it's described where dust is their food and clay their sustenance, where they see no light and dwell in darkness. Okay, so that's just a bit of, you know, give you a bit of an idea of some of the beliefs here. Excuse me. Whoops. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, how the religion of ancient Israel, well, now it seems that my face shows up here, walking the patriarchs. Foundational to the religion of ancient Israel is, you know, if you want to think of them like the founding fathers, they're known as the patriarchs, beginning with the figure of Abraham. Okay, and as you can see here on the right, you have Abraham, and then there's Isaac, and then Esau and Jacob, and then you have 12 names there. Those are going to be the 12 sons of Jacob. They're going to become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob will have his name changed to Israel in this history. That's where we get the word Israel from. We'll talk about that down the road. But anyway, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are usually referred to as the patriarchs. And it all begins with the figure of Abraham. Now, Abraham was not a Sumerian, okay, in that sense. He was a Semite. And these are, and again, there's a lot we don't know about this ancient people in terms of where a lot of these people came from, who they all are. But he was it seems, of a different ethnicity here, and was settled in the city of Ur that I had mentioned. And you can see it here in that map there, okay, just south of Baghdad in what's today Iraq. And you can see here the little track line going up. He gets called by God, to leave the city of Ur and to head west towards what becomes known as, what was referred to at that time as the Land of Canaan. okay, which is over there where Israel, Lebanon, Palestine is, that region there. Okay, and those are kind of like the route that he follows, as you can see. Now, this is where the story begins, is with the call of Abraham, okay, with this figure. And there, I just put that other map right there again. And as I mentioned, he was living in the city of Ur around the year 1800 BC or so. That's what's presumed here. And he is spoken to by his, quote, God. And the word for that is El, E-L. A word that we find in ancient Hebrew is the basis of the word Allah in Islam. In Arabic, it's the basis of the word Elohim in Hebrew, which means the God of gods, okay? It's also a word that was used by the ancient Canaanites and by the Sumerians, and simply meaning deity, a deity, okay? And so he's spoken to by a deity and told to head west to the land of Canaan. And that's why and how it becomes known as the promised land, okay? A land promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. That's going to be later referred to as the land of Israel. Now, the interesting thing here is, I think it's interesting, and it's not talked about much, who on earth is this God that spoke to Abraham? Okay, because what happens is we tend to read into the text later developments of the concept of God that evolves here in the history of Judaism, and of course all religions in a sense, and we bring today our present day concept of God with a big G into the picture. And yet putting things in historical context, all right, and this is something that isn't talked about much, but if you read with the Sumerians, they had a belief at that time that everyone had their own personal, quote, El, their personal God. And you could think of this God as almost like your personal guardian spirit. It's very much in alignment with, and this is what most people don't realize this, but because of my study of all the world religions and what I'll study here in terms of religion, I've come across this so much, that it is so universal to human experience, the belief of a particular personified, your inner daemon, to use that phrase, the inner genie or genius, an inner kind of higher self guardian spirit, what in shamanic cultures they often refer to as a power animal or spirit animal, that is your guide, your special protector and guide. And you'll find this all over the world, these kind of references, similar experiences, and whatnot, okay? And I could go on about that, but I find this very interesting. So the Sumerians themselves believed that everyone had a personal God that was responsible for their existence and was to provide for them, protect them, and guide them. And this is very similar to what you find in more indigenous traditions that talk about having a power animal or spirit animal, okay, or spirit guide. So this God was largely seen in parental terms by the Sumerians as a divine father or mother, commonly referred to as the God who created or engendered you, all right, brought you into being, and so that you are in a sense their son or daughter, and that the family was held to be under the direct guidance of this particular deity. So you'll see this, like even in Arabia, there were tribal deities. Allah was the tribal deity, the guardian spirit over the tribe that Muhammad belonged to, for example. Okay, so you have this. It kind of evolves into tribal deities, that your clan, your descendants are under the guidance and protection of this particular deity. Okay, it's associated with that family. And I do suspect that this is, the very origins here, and it's something really quite universal. So, anyways, to continue on here, later in Hebrew and among the Canaanites, which is the land of Canaan, which has become later known as Israel, right? El was a common word for God. And as I already mentioned later on, it's related to the Arabic word for Allah. And Elohim, as I mentioned, is a common term for God amongst the Hebrews. It's a plural form, is often referred to in Hebrew as the plural of majesty, meaning the God of gods, like the number one dude up there. Okay, he's the most important God, the number one God. And it all begins here with the God of Israel. Okay, whoops. Oh dear. Okay. And I think I was going to, well, anyways, did I say enough about that? I think so. So yeah, it's something very interesting, I find. And anyways, I'll talk more about this in my Nature of Religion class, in terms of other examples of how this shows up in other cultures. But anyways, so here, because in the Bible itself, in terms of this whole tradition, there's next to nothing said about really who this God is, okay? And yet the beliefs about this God, it will evolve and develop over time, all right? Okay, so I just want to put things in historical context here. So what happens here? He is spoken to by this God. And again, there's not much fleshed out here in terms of the texts. Okay. And again, the stories are in the Bible. That's where we get this information from. Okay. This is where the story, the tradition is. It's in the Jewish Bible, Christian Bible. You know, Christians call it the Old Testament. The Jews call it the Tanakh. In the first book of Genesis. Genesis is the very first book of the Bible. And in Genesis chapter 12, it describes this. This is where God is speaking to Abraham. And originally his name was Abram, okay? But then it kind of takes on a bit more of a plural form later on. And it goes like this, where God says to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Okay, so this is the call of Abraham. He is given this mission, so to speak, to go and leave the city of Ur and head west toward the land of Canaan. And that this land that doesn't really belong to him, he's a foreigner, he's an outsider, right? But the promise is that God promises that he will give to him this land. And he also promises that he will make a great nation out of him, i.e., he will have many descendants. And that through him, the world will be blessed. Okay, there's something special and important that's going to come up here. And then to continue on, and a few chapters down, Genesis 15, he has look up into the heavens and count all the stars. That's how many your descendants will be, right? That's the number of your offspring. Okay, so this call of Abraham becomes known as the covenant, the contract. The Abrahamic covenant is kind of a special contract made between God and Abraham. And so I'll just read this to you. As for me, this is my covenant with you. This is God speaking. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, but your name will be Abraham. I will make nations of you, and kings will come for you. I will establish my covenant, this contract, as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. And the whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, a foreigner, I will give to you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Okay, this is the promise. This is the covenant. Now, as for you, God says, now you're part of the deal here. You must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you. This is what you must do. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And that circumcision will be a sign. It's like a seal, a stamp, okay, that finalizes that contract between me and you. Okay, that's in Genesis 17. And so this is foundational to Judaism. And that's why in the intro I said what Judaism is about as a religion is about this special contract that gets entered into by Abraham, the father of the Jews, with the God of Abraham that will go on for millennia, okay, to this day. All right. So now the word Hebrews, these people, Abraham and his descendants, are going to be referred to not that often, okay, because it wasn't a word that they liked to use for themselves. It was actually a bit more of a derogatory word. But the root word for the word Hebrew means someone who is a foreigner, someone who has come over from somewhere else, who has crossed over, came from elsewhere, is a foreigner in this land. Okay, that's the root meaning of the word Hebrew. And we do have in ancient sources references to the Hebrews, like Egyptian and others. Habiru or Apiru is the way it appears in those sources. But meaning is somebody who's come from outside, is a nomad, is a stranger, an outsider coming in to this land as a foreigner and has really no permanent place here. Okay, that they just used the land. They were nomads going through the land of Canaan, but didn't actually officially own it. Right? And this is kind of the story about Abraham. He kind of went through the land, but didn't really own it. But so that when his wife Sarah died, he had to buy a cave in order to bury her there, right? Because he did not have any land that he actually owned. And it's going to be a land that's going to come into the possession of the Hebrews down the road, okay? But it's just being promised to them at this point through Abraham. So anyways, what we see happening here? We see here a very strong tie between a particular deity and an individual ancestor in a context, though, where deities traditionally had been tied to locality. So when we see in ancient Sumeria there, the gods, they were stuck. This was their house on earth, was in a temple on earth in that place, and that was their home. That's where they stayed put. Okay. Whereas here now we have a God that traveled with Abraham. And the relationship between them was one of a contract of commitment and not necessarily one of place, where a deities in the past were more associated with a place, that this God belongs here. You want to worship this God, you got to go to this temple to worship that God in that place. All right, that was sort of the norm in the Sumerian context there, okay, preceding Abraham. Right? So this is a bit of a novel idea of this emphasis of God traveling with you. But really, in one sense, it probably is more of the original idea of even, more pre-civilization, like nomadic hunter-gatherer type societies. Now, the catch is that, okay, you have these promises, but Abraham's wife hadn't been able to bear a child. And yet there's this promise from God, so to speak, that he's going to have all these descendants. Okay. And so what happens here in the story is that his wife, Sarah, tells Abraham, listen, you need to now have to get a child somehow, because it's obvious I'm not having one. And the story is that they were in their 90s. Okay. And so she says, take our servant girl here, our maidservant Hagar, to see if she can bear you a child. So you at least will have a son to pass everything on to. Okay. And so indeed, Hagar becomes pregnant, and she does have a son, and his name is Ishmael. And this is where this is going to be very important later on in Islam. Okay, the whole Islamic story a lot of things get picked up here in Islam. Okay, we'll see that later, but just so you're aware of that. And so it's stated, though, here that, yes, Ishmael, and Ishmael also will have many descendants who will be in hostility toward all his brothers. This is in Genesis 16. And the Arabs see themselves as being descendants of Abraham through the figure of Ishmael. And so Abraham is going to become the father of both the Jews and the Arabs that indeed have been in hostility. Well, 13 years later is when Sarah miraculously gives birth to the son Isaac. Okay, of whom then the Jews are descendants of. And this is a key thing. You see, the way the story is presented here for the Jewish people is it's all a miracle. The land of Israel is one that's given by God, and therefore it's theirs by divine right as a part of a contract, okay, between Abraham and God. And the people themselves, they come about through a miracle that Sarah, even though there's no way she could or should be able to have children, she indeed does have children. And that it's a miracle. It's God's mighty hand at work that brings about descendants of Abraham through Sarah, okay, and the birthing of Isaac. So that the people and the land, and therefore the future nation of Israel, is there by divine right, by the hand of God. That's going to be a key theme in the history of ancient Israel, right? It's all a mighty work of God in their history. Okay, all right. Anyway, so after Sarah gives birth to Isaac, right? The one thing I need to explain here, and let me just pause share for a sec. Okay, can I pause share? Your screen sharing is paused. Okay, good. I don't know. I think he sees me. One thing that people don't realize, see, in the ancient world, in this context here, in the ancient Near East, the firstborn son is of the highest importance. The firstborn son is to receive a special blessing. So before the father dies, he would lay his hands on his son and have a special prayer of blessing upon his son, where all his authority, the father's authority, all of his rights, power, privileges is passed on to the firstborn son, and he also gets most of the inheritance. Okay, as he now is to continue on to be the head of the family, having the authority and power, the special blessing and inheritance. Okay, and that's why we get this idea that the patriarchs, Abraham, gets passed on to Isaac, gets passed on to his son Jacob. Right, this is a key thing here. And so Sarah, she didn't want this to be given to the son of the servant girl. She felt like, no, I'm the wife. All right. This should be to our son because I am the wife of Abraham. And so this authority and blessing and inheritance, it should be passed on to my son, Isaac. Okay. And not to Ishmael. Right. And this is going to be something that shows up in this story here. So anyways, so she then tells Abraham, listen, I want you to send Hagar and Ishmael away. I want our son Isaac to become the head of the family and to inherit all the blessing and the goods, basically. Okay, so this is what she sets up. And Abraham agrees, and he sends Hagar and Ishmael away with food and provisions and whatnot, and they're sent off. And even here in the Bible has a story that they run out of water somewhere in the desert, and God miraculously provides a well for them so they could have water, so they didn't die, and they continued, to survive. And in Islam, it picks that up. That story is there in the Quran as well. And it's held that well, that water is there in Mecca. Okay. And it's a sacred well that in Muslim tradition, it's a part of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, is to go and visit this holy well of holy water. That's believed, that's tied in with this story here in the Bible. Okay. All right. So I shall resume share and go on to the next one. Okay, so here again, just so you can see, so you've got Abraham there. Through Hagar, they give birth to Ishmael, who then the Arabs see themselves descendants of. Then Sarah gets pregnant with Isaac and gives birth to Isaac, and the Jews see themselves as descendants through Isaac. And what's going to happen next in the story is that, and let me mention this, the promise that God made to Abraham in the story here, he makes that promise again to Isaac. He speaks to Isaac and says, yes, I am the God of your father, Abraham. And just as I promised your father the land and descendants and blessing, I pass that on to you, Isaac. Okay. And I can't remember now what I have on the next slide. Okay, well, here I say this. Okay, but let me just backtrack. Can I go backtrack? Okay, good. And then Isaac is going to have, his wife is going to give birth to twins. And Esau is actually going to come out first, be the firstborn, and Jacob is second. But I'll tell the story in the next slide. He kind of gets swindled out of it, and Jacob receives the blessing, the especially the prayer of blessing from his father Isaac, and the covenant, the contract gets passed on to Jacob, and then Jacob will have 12 sons. And those are the 12 sons listed there. And each son is going to be the head of a tribe, because you've got a tribal society here, right? And they're going to become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. And why Israel? Because there's this whole story of how Jacob is, again, there's a lot of stories here. He has his name changed to Israel. He is told by God, in a sense, to change his name to Israel. Okay. And that's where the word Israel comes from. So there you go. Okay, and so just, here, at the time of the Romans, their area of Israel becomes known as Judea, and that's where we get the word Judaism from, and the word Jew, eventually, Judeans or Jews. Okay, that's derived from the word Judea. Okay, just so you know how the different terms come together. Okay, so, all right, so here. I just have written out exactly what I just told you, that God spoke to Abraham, made the promised land to send blessings. Likewise, he did that to Isaac, passes on the promise. Now, Isaac married Rebekah, who gave birth to twins. All right. And again, it was an answer to prayer. She wasn't able to give birth. So it's a miracle again. Okay. Again, it's always a miracle. And so Esau came out first, as I said. However, Rebekah favored Jacob. She wanted Jacob to be the one to receive the blessing, the story goes. Jacob was more refined. Esau was more rough and gruff kind of a guy. And she just favored Jacob. So she tells Jacob, as Isaac is about to die, he's pretty much on his deathbed. He's really old. He's blind. Okay. He's about to die. And it was custom that you provide a feast for, your father before they die. It's like sort of their last great meal. And then he would then pass on a special prayer of blessing before the meal to the firstborn son. Okay, it's sort of expecting his passing, right? So she then told Jacob, listen, let's send your brother out to get the food ready for this special meal. But in the meantime, let's have you pretend as though you're Esau. All right. Since Esau is hairy and always works out with the cattle and it kind of smells like the cattle, we'll put on a fur skin on you so you'll feel hairy and smell a bit more like a cow or whatever, like your brother Esau, and kind of speak rough like your brother would. And let's fool your father in thinking that you are indeed Esau, so that he will pray that special prayer of blessing on top of you. All right, while Esau is getting the meal ready, right? And so that's kind of the plan. So Isaac, he kind of feels him. Yeah, that's hairy. Yeah, you smell like Esau. And okay, and he passes on the blessing onto Jacob. And just as he's finished, Esau comes in with this fabulous meal for his father, and he sees that he got gypped out of his rightful place as being the head of the family and all that. And anyways, he then wants to kill Jacob, and Jacob has to run for his life. Okay, so this is the story, right? So anyways, to make a long story short, there's a lot of stories here, and that's why the Bible's always been very powerful. There's a lot of amazing stories in there. They're very powerful stories in various levels. So what happens, though, is that God speaks to Jacob, passes on the promises to him, tells him, though, also change his name to Israel. It's sort of wrestling with an angel story that you have there. And as he's journeying around, because he had to leave his area because his brother would want to kill him, he goes to this well to get some water, and he sees the most beautiful woman there, and he wants to marry her. Her name's Rachel. So he goes to her father and asks for her hand in marriage. And he says, well, after you've done 7 years of service to me. He does 7 years of service to his future father-in-law. The wedding happens, and the wedding night takes place, and his future bride is covered in a veil, and they go into the tent to consummate the marriage. In the morning, he wakes up in the daylight to find out that he did not, in fact, marry Rachel, but her sister, Leah. And so he goes to his father-in-law and says, oh, you gypped me? And he says, yeah, well, okay, there you go. I had to marry her off first. And so after another 7 years, you can finally have my daughter, Rachel. So he had to do another 7 years, and then he got his beloved Rachel. So the thing is, in this story here, is that Leah was able to just have babies, and she gave him 10 sons. Kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. His beloved Rachel, that he loved dearly, she had a hard time becoming pregnant. And again, it's a bit of a miracle. And she finally gives birth to Joseph. Okay, so Joseph is the firstborn of his beloved Rachel, right? Then she gives birth to the second one, Benjamin, and she died during that process. So those are the 12. These 12 sons are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, why do I tell you that? Because this is what led to Joseph, who is the firstborn of the beloved Rachel and also favored by Jacob. He was given the coat of many colors, they made a movie based on that, that is something you would give to your firstborn son, who's going to receive the inheritance and the special blessing and all that I just mentioned to you, okay? So with that, the other 10 brothers that were of Leah, they're very jealous. And they just resented this. So they conspire one day to get rid of Joseph. So they say, oh, let's all go out hunting. And they all go out hunting. And they were thinking of killing him. But then one of them said, well, let's not do that. Let's leave him here in this pit. Let's sell him as a slave to these people going into Egypt. And so he gets sold into slavery, right? For people going into Egypt, he's sold as a slave. And they then went back to the father, Jacob, saying that, oh yeah, they were hunting and this lion came, and Joseph was so brave and fought off this lion, but the lion got him, and they had some bloody clothes of Joseph saying, oh, he's dead. So the father, Jacob, thinks his beloved son, Joseph, is dead, right? But actually, this is what all happened instead. So to make a long story short, he then ends up going to Egypt as a slave. He's in this household as a servant in this home, and it seems like a higher level official of some kind. And the wife, who's always in the house, had this thing for Joseph and tried to seduce him, wanted him to kind of have sex with her, but he refused. And so she then gets angry at his rejections of her, and she then claims that he assaulted her, all right, and charges him with attempted rape or whatever at that time. So he then ends up in prison, okay? And while he's in prison, he is known as having a gift for dream interpretation. Other prisoners get the word that, oh, he's really good at interpreting dreams. So again, to make a long story short, the Pharaoh of Egypt has this dream. And this dream is about that there's these, I think, 7 cows that are fat, and then 7 cars that are skinny and starving. And he knows this dream means something really important, but he doesn't know what it is. And he gets all of his magicians and advisors there, and nobody can answer his dreams. And so somebody there who spent some time in prison says, I heard of this guy, Joseph. He's able to interpret dreams. And so the Pharaoh calls upon Joseph to come and interpret the dream for him. And Joseph tells him, yes, this is what the dream means, that Egypt is going to have 7 years of a bountiful harvest, bumper crops. There's going to be so much food that they'll be able to grow in the next 7 years. But then it's going to be followed by 7 years of drought, where we're going to struggle to have our crops grow, and there's going to be a shortage of food. And so the message of the dream is to store as much food as we can in the first 7 years so we can make it through the following 7 years of drought. And the Pharaoh thought, bango, that's it. That makes so much sense. And then he appoints Joseph to oversee the operation. Okay, he basically appoints him to a position of power in Egypt to oversee the whole, food and agricultural industry at the time, so to speak. Okay, this is kind of what happens. So he comes into a position of power. Now, what's interesting here is that normally, there's no way the actual Egyptians, would allow a foreign people like a Semite, like Joseph, to come into power like that. But we do know that Egypt was under the rule of foreigners, Semites known as the Hyksos, from around the 1700s into the 1550s. Okay, and that is generally the time period in there somewhere that this story of Joseph most likely took place. Okay. And so again, to make a long story short here, indeed, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. It was a time of famine that hit the larger Middle Eastern region. And we do know from many sources that indeed a lot of people would go to Egypt to get food during times of famine, because the huge, the Nile River, and that was so reliable for the cultivation of crops. Okay, that it was very common for people to go there to get food when they found that, they were in drought conditions elsewhere. And we have many references like that in sources. So the story is that that's how Jacob and his clan of sons and grandchildren and yada yada go to Egypt to get food. Again, long story short, a reunion takes place. Okay, there's a lot. I got to shorten this up here. And as a result, they settle in that region. Then what happens? Down the road, the Hyksos are overthrown, the Egyptians are back in power, and the Hebrews become enslaved. And that is then what sets up the next phase of the story of Moses and the whole Exodus event. But I think I am going to pause this. Where am I here? How do I pause this? How do I, no, that's not here. I go. I want to Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording for here and we'll continue in another recording. Okay, all right.